During the alternate Second World War, the Allies found themselves outnumbered by the man and material might of the Soviet Union. Because of this, the Allies sought ways to shift the balance of power in their favor, such as conducting covert operations behind enemy lines, and recruiting brilliant minds like Albert Einstein to conduct research and development of new technologies. However, Stalin was keenly aware of this, and pressured his generals to crush the Allies quickly, fulfilling his dream of a continental Soviet Union. It would take time for Allied scientists to develop the weapons they needed to turn the tide of the war. So in order to hinder or distract advancing Soviet forces, the Allies made use of fake structures. Fake structures looked exactly like real ones, but had zero functionality outside their role as decoys. The Allies only made fake versions of critical structures, these being the construction yard, war factory, radar dome, and naval yard. No matter the type of structure, all decoys cost the same to build, were constructed significantly faster than their real-life counterparts, and only consumed a small amount of power. However, fake structures can also be destroyed faster, having only half the structural integrity of the real structures they mimicked. In addition, no survivors would emerge in the wake of a fake structure's collapse. When an Allied commander no longer had use of any surviving fake structures, he could sell them for extra credits. There was no way for Soviet commanders to tell the difference between a fake or real structure until after they had already committed forces to destroying it, an action that could take up valuable time and manpower to accomplish. A great example of this was during an Allied operation in Poland called Pawn. Acting on misinformation provided to them by the Allies, the Soviets sent a division to destroy what they thought was a heavy weapons facility. It wasn't, but the Allies wanted the Soviets to believe it was real, stationing a small force of infantry and armor to defend the base and its critical but fake structures. The Allied commander in charge of defending the base held out for 25 minutes against waves of attacking Soviet forces. Afterward, reinforcements were provided to the Allied commander, enabling him to establish an actual base and build up his own forces. The Soviet division attempted to call for their own reinforcements, but couldn't due to losing their radar dome to the counter-attacking Allies. The Soviet base would end up being completely wiped out by the Allied commander, completing the operation. Albert Einstein's work with the Allies led to the creation of the chronosphere, a system that could, theoretically, move a unit from one location to another without having to cross the space in between. The research facility working on the chronosphere project was located outside Liechtenstein, and had been subject to regular bombing raids by the Soviets. It was difficult for the Soviet bombers to accurately target the facility, thanks to a new defense system called the gap generator. The gap generator was basically a tower topped with what looks to be a spinning U-shaped magnet. This generator causes all objects within its vicinity to disappear, though disappear isn't exactly the correct term. More accurately, the objects around the generator are hidden within a shroud that breaks up radio waves, thus creating gaps in the so-called electromagnetic continuum. With the help of these gap generators, alongside reinforcements and a competent commander, the Allies were able to protect the Chronosphere research facility from both air and ground attacks conducted by the Soviets. With the final tests of the Chronosphere complete, the Allies were now at the turning point of the war. Gap generators would later become available for all Allied commanders to construct at their bases. These generators were the most power-consuming of all Allied defense structures, but that cost was sometimes worth being able to permanently hide construction, recruiting, and other strategic operations at a base. Without sufficient power, the gap generator would remain offline, though the top would still rotate. Soviet spy planes flying over an Allied base could temporarily see through the shroud for a couple of seconds, but once past, the area would be immediately re-shrouded by the generator. The shroud also made it difficult for Soviet ground forces to target Allied units or structures, thus making the generator a vital target for the Soviets to destroy when assaulting an Allied base. Allied commanders wondered if it was possible to create a mobile version of the gap generator. Allied scientists and engineers came through for them, creating the mobile gap generator, which was a downsized version of the standard generator, placed on the back of a flatbed truck. Though it generated a smaller gap field, the mobile generator could hide several units, blocking the Soviets from seeing exactly what units were being sent against them. This also meant that in combat, Soviet units had a difficult time actually targeting those Allied units within the generator's field. This made it imperative for Soviet forces to find and focus their fire on the mobile gap generator. The mobile gap generator was only lightly armored, and other than being able to run over infantry, was completely defenseless. The mobile generator was also slow-moving, so it was important to make sure that faster Allied vehicles did not stray too far away from it, foregoing the benefits of the Shroud. Thanks to their advanced technology, the Allies were able to shift the course of the war and ultimately go on to claim victory over the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of the war, Alexander Romanov became premier of the Soviet Union, and for a time, there was peace between them and the Allied nations. During this peace, Romanov rebuilt the Soviet military, and when the time was right, launched a full-scale invasion of the United States, igniting the Third World War. Like in the previous war, much of the Allied strategy revolved around gathering superior information, while also denying information to the Soviets. While mobile gap generators had been retired, the standard gap generators were once again used to hide Allied bases beneath a shroud. Though it featured a new design, the gap generator was still one of the more power-consuming defense structures. In fact, the only defense system that was equal to the gap generator in power consumption was France's Grand Cannon. Soviet spy planes could still temporarily uncover segments of a shrouded base, but once gone, the segments would be recovered by the gap generator. This was the same for Yuri's Psychic Reveal. This meant that enemy forces assaulting an Allied base would need to consider focusing on destroying the generator first. Alternatively, they could target power generators, knowing the gap generator couldn't function without sufficient power. As with the previous war, the Allies were able to turn the course of the Third World War in their favor. This was despite the shenanigans of Premier Romanov's advisor Yuri, who attempted to mind control the world with his psychic dominators. Using a time machine made by Albert Einstein, the Allies were able to halt this psychic disaster. Afterward, the conflict between the Allies and Soviets would reignite. Using their superior technology, much of which was created by Einstein, the Allies were set for another victory over their nemesis. However, thanks to a newly created time machine hidden beneath the Kremlin, Soviet Colonel Anatoly Cherdenko, along with General Krukov and scientist Gregor Zelinsky, traveled back to 1927 to eliminate Einstein. This action created a new timeline, one where the Soviets were winning the Third World War against the Allies, at least until they were suddenly attacked by the Empire of the Rising Sun. Though the timeline had been altered, some technologies the Allies used in previous iterations were still present. This included the gap generator, though this time, it wasn't a separate device on its own. Instead, the generator was attached to the Allies' formidable Mirage tank. So called due to its onboard reactive camo scanner technology, the Mirage tank was able to camouflage itself into seemingly mundane objects, such as a tree or civilian vehicle. This function only affected the Mirage tank itself, and only while it remained still, ready to strike at any enemy units that got within range of its Spectrum cannon. When outfitted with the latest DeLamp FT-70 gap generator, the Mirage tank could invert its camo projector field onto nearby Allied forces bearing the appropriate transmitters. While Mirage tanks couldn't disguise themselves or use their weapon while the gap generator was active, they were able to conceal small armies in this fashion, causing enemy forces to grossly underestimate their numbers. Since the Mirage tank itself wasn't camouflaged while the gap generator was active, this made it a prime target for enemy forces to focus fire on in battle, and given the Mirage tank's lack of heavy armor, the vehicle would go down quickly. Alternatively, units such as the Soviets' Warbears or the Empire's burst drones could see right through the shroud of the Mirage tank's gap generator, negating its effects. Shortly after the Allies defeated the Empire of the Rising Sun, they received word that the Soviet Union was preparing to launch a surprise attack against them from a secret base in Cuba. To find out exactly what the Soviets were up to, the Allies sent a couple of commanders to investigate. The Allied commanders arrived at Havana Harbor with a scouting force of spies and a single Mirage tank. This must have been a modified Mirage tank, as it was able to disguise itself as a Soviet Apocalypse tank, while also being able to maintain its gap generator field. This field was vital in hiding any Soviet units that the spies had managed to bribe while scouting out the port. The spies were able to amass a sizable force of defectors, which the Allied commanders used to destroy what they believed was the only Soviet base in the city. They quickly found out that this base wasn't the only one, and that the Soviets had hidden facilities beneath sports stadiums. Emerging from these stadiums were Kirovs, each armed with a 50-megaton warhead to strike an Allied city of the Soviets' choosing. The Allied commanders called in reinforcements and were able to destroy all the stadiums, while preventing any Kirovs from escaping the region. In the aftermath of this event, the Allies would go on to directly assault Leningrad, where the leaders of the Soviet Union, Cherdenko and Krukov, would be captured, bringing an end to the war. While perhaps underappreciated, gap generators were one of the more unique technologies that the Allies used during their major conflicts with the Soviet Union. Such devices enabled the Allies to hide the development of advanced systems like the chronosphere, which was essential in allowing them to claim victory over the Soviet Union in their initial war. Even in their compact and mobile form as part of the new Mirage tanks, these gap generators contributed in winning battles large and small, making them a conductive component of the Allied arsenal.